Thank everybody for coming. Thanks especially to Jenny for taking care of technology and for our four speakers tonight. I will just review where we've been and where we're going. Our purpose for tonight is to answer the question, where do we go from here? So let me move forward here. Our speakers are Rob Brennan, who until last week was with Housing Assistance Corporation as the Chief Legal Officer and is the founder and president of Mass Housing and Climate Innovation Center. And Representative Thomas Moakley, who is our rep for divisions for precincts 1, 2, and 6 in Falmouth, as well as the islands, and grew up in Falmouth. Bob Leary, our Falmouth Planning Board member, and for 33 years has been a volunteer supervisor for Habitat for Humanity Cape Cod construction. And Jack Dolly is the president and CEO of Northland Residential Corporation, who has been building over 1,000 housing units on the Cape, as well as across New England, and as well as being on the board of Cape Cod 5 and Cape Cod Community Health Center. And he'll share a little bit more as the president of the Bourne Conservation Trust. So I'm going to just take a few minutes and share with you what tonight is about and where are we coming from. So we've had, this is our fourth session. In the first session, we had our focus was, where are we when it comes to preserving the land? How much land on the Cape is already developed? There's about 86%. But that's a little bit misleading, and a significant amount of that is protected land, but not all the protected land is fully protected. It's not that we shouldn't be developing. That's our message is not we shouldn't be developing, but that we should be developing in certain ways and selectively. We should be protecting land, not perhaps, for example, building close to cities, to the centers of our towns, to avoid more transportation than is necessary, not close to sensitive areas, to have a negative impact on those areas, and doing so in such a way that's responsible and is part of a plan. In addition to that, we had the director of natural resource development for the Wampanoag tribe, Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, who spoke about the history of protection of the land and housing, and his recommendations for what we should be doing, how to do this in a balanced way, which has the message from him, since we won't hear from him tonight, was basically the message should be the priority is community. That if you put the community first, everything falls into place. But on the other hand, we may have gone beyond everything falling into place. So what do we do about that? In our third session, we had our, in our second session, we had Rob Brennan and Habitat for Humanity talk about housing and what are the restraints, what are the new laws, what are the new changes in zoning, and what is responsible development in today's world, and how do we do that in a way that deals with the barriers for doing that well, but keeps the mind on the future, as well as who needs that housing and how much housing can we afford to have from the environment's perspective, as well as the people's perspective. And then last time we had Bob Leary, who's here again, and who is on the Falmouth Planning Board, as well as the member of the Planning Board for Barnstable. And they talked about the reality of trying to make this work in the towns in today's world. If you don't have water, you can't be building because people won't have water to drink. If you take every house that is bought, and on a 1 acre piece of land, you go from a small little affordable house to a gigantic mansion that's a second or third home for someone, and you keep doing that, then we won't have housing affordability. And we'll be using up all of our our land, as well as um, all of our natural resources. Um, so what do you do with that? And what's the frustration? And how do you remove those barriers? Um, and then tonight, we're going to be talking about where do we go from here. So we're going to be hearing them from the perspectives of the developer, the land preserver, who's the same person, from the planning board member, who's also the developer of housing that's affordable through Habitat, our state representative, who's also someone who grew up here and cares about where we live for the future. It's not an impersonal thing, it's a very personal thing. From someone who is an attorney, who also is founder and president of the Mass Housing and Climate Innovation Center, and focuses on how do we innovate? How do we do something besides develop, develop, develop? But how do we do that in a meaningful, planful way? With a focus on preserving for the future and community. Um, and so from all of these perspectives, did I mention everyone? I think so. Did I mention you, Jack, just now? So we have the developer who's also the preserver. So everyone has more than one perspective here. And that's what I think keeps us all balanced. So tonight, rather than saying what's the answer, we're going to be asking where should we be headed? What is a reasonable thing to expect of ourselves and our land and our housing? And when should we expect to get there if we do what? And what are the barriers? And how do we remove those barriers? And how do we not just push, push, push for our own NIMBYism of saying, this is what I care about, so that's what we're going to do? No, we have to compromise. We have to listen to one another. And we need transformational leadership, which means that we need to be talking about innovation. We need to be talking about thinking differently, collaborating differently, communicating differently, and thinking of the future in a new way. And that's what we're going to be doing by the end. So the order that we're going to be talking in, first we'll be hearing from Bob Leary, who's going to give the perspective of the planning board and other perspectives that he has. And then Jack, and then Rob, and then Thomas. So I think you'll find it interesting. This is being videotaped, and it's all of these are going on to the same YouTube channel, so they'll be available to anyone who's interested. So why don't we get started with Bob? We've asked each of the people, our speakers, to talk about what is their life like as to when it comes to this context, and where do they see this going? Where do they think it should go? And what are the barriers from the world that they live in? And what do they think we should be thinking about when we come to where do we go from here and how do we get there and how do we make sure we can? So that's going to be where Bob is, and we'll go through the others. We're going to hold the questions until the end, and we'll do that before we open it up. Nanette, did you have a question? Can you let Nanette talk, please?
Get in.
You're all set?
Rudolph's trying to get in, just letting.
Oh, okay. If you could let Rudolph in, if he doesn't, is he showing?
I am connected. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
But I don't show up as a participant, curiously enough. But I'm in and hear everything.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Bye. Sorry, we will miss your beautiful face. Perhaps another time. All right, Bob Leary, we're asking each person to talk for about 10 minutes. And then any time along the way, if you come up with a question, please put it in the chat. And then Jenny is going to be monitoring the chat. And any questions we have, we're going to do at the end of all 4 presentations. And then we'll open it up for the conversation to answer the question, where do we go from here and how do we get there? Okay, Bob, it's all yours.
Good evening. From the discussions that we've had before, what really comes to the fore is what role zoning has played in this problem. How we started out with smaller lots and then they became larger lots, and to the point where you had all this land being taken up by single residence homes. So how do we try to backtrack on that? And with Falmouth, we're looking at the Seasonal Communities Act, which is calling for utilizing smaller lots that have been deemed unbuildable. We were also one of the pioneers on the Cape for the accessory apartment bylaw that we have, which has been very successful. Now the state has made that a by right use so that anybody can put an ADU onto their property. We've looked at multi-housing districts. We've looked at business redevelopment. And what we're trying to do is incorporate housing into a lot of other zones and structures. We really want to promote housing on top of businesses. When we're looking at the plaza in downtown Falmouth, we've had a consultant come in, give us a big picture of that, how that would look with streetscapes and businesses and housing dispersed throughout. Because what we're trying to do is, what most everybody on the Cape is trying to do is keep all their building and their housing in the village centers where you have sewer primarily, you have transportation, and you have amenities. So once you get out of the sewer districts, then you're looking at maybe taking larger lots and subdividing them into smaller parcels, and that might be coming down the pike with the tiny homes initiative that's been instituted by the state. Then you're looking at innovative septic systems. How do you do that? Whether you're doing shared systems. What kind of housing do we want to see in those? Falmouth has always pushed for cluster developments so that you can leave open space. And you see the little cottage communities on a small lot where you have smaller homes. And that's what Habitat has been about, is mostly because of our clientele. We build smaller homes. Our homes are 1,200 to 1,400 square feet. So trying to reintroduce the whole idea of starter homes on the Cape for our families is what we've been kind of pushing for, and also for rentals. We have a real lack of rental space in town. We're trying to get people to redevelop existing old businesses like the nursing home on Main Street. That's kind of hit a snag right now, but there's a great proposal for that. And the other thing that comes down into play is water and sewer. How much can this piece of sand support? And it was really surprising to me to find out how much of the Cape has been developed. I've only been around here for a short time, and it just seems to me that we just can't constantly be building on open land, on cutting down trees. All that we need trees and open spaces for water protection. We are a sole source aquifer. What goes into the soil can end up in our drinking water and our bays and estuaries. So I found similar things with the people that we've had this discussion with, and we're here in Falmouth. We're still pushing. There's still a lot of pushback when it comes to affordable housing. There's a stigma attached to anything deemed affordable. You do have NIMBYism, which was a topic that came up. That's a tough row to hoe, trying to get people to understand what you're trying to do and how do you go about doing that. So that's all I got for what we discussed. So I'd like to hear from other people.
You've had two quick questions for you.
Sure.
So if you think things happen the way you think they should, where would we be 10 years from now?
We would have more rentals. We would have older buildings that no longer function for the purpose they were designed for, turned into housing. I could see more cottage type developments, cluster types of developments. I could see larger lots, the 2-acre lots, subdivided into smaller lots.
And you talked about in your presentation that as a planning board member, you hit a lot of roadblocks.
Yeah.
You know what should happen, but it just doesn't happen. Can you talk a little bit about those roadblocks and how you think they could be removed?
Uh, Anything we do when it comes to zoning has to go through town meeting. And I explained when we went through our accessory apartment bylaw, we went with 40% of the existing structure because the perception was if it was 50%, people were thinking duplexes and they did not want two-family homes on their property or their neighbor's property. So trying to overcome that, it's a matter. And what we did for that is we did a lot of public meetings. We did FCTV discussion with people on TV. We promoted that. We had focus groups. So a lot of it is being able to communicate to people what it is exactly you're doing, because when they hear about things just when it's coming to town meeting, they don't really have all the information that they really need to make an informed decision.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bob. All right, Jack, you ready?
Ready, set, go. Well, thank you. Good night. Good evening, everyone. And Lou and others, thank you for organizing and hosting these discussions over the course of the last month. And thank you for inviting me. As I said to Lou last night, sort of getting ready for this, I'm struck a little bit about, by the title of our program here tonight, and that being preserving Cape Cod undeveloped land, those 5 words, and housing affordability. Those are 2 radically different things. Having grown up on the Cape and watched development occur over the last 40 years, it's really easy to do one. It's really hard to do the other. And it's going to take everyone on this call and many others outside of this call, listening to this call and around us, to figure out how to crack the nut of doing both. If we only do one, either build more housing or preserve more land, we're not going to, we're going to create other issues. So it's going to take an awful lot. We are really smart people on this call, and there are really smart people around the table that care deeply about, the sandbar that we're on, the environment that we're on, the people that live, our neighbors. So we need to figure out where it is appropriate to preserve open tracts of land from development or overdevelopment, but also, as Bob Leary said, where it is appropriate to develop in an intense or densify densely, dense fashion, other pieces of land. Right on Main Street, there's a classic example of a project that was probably 10 years in the making that's only now coming out of the ground. It's on Main Street. It's on sewer. It's on infrastructure. It's on traffic infrastructure. It will generate foot traffic up and down Main Street and car traffic. We're a car society. But all of that will benefit the businesses and make those businesses more sustainable. So, I'm here on this call because, as I've said to Rob, and Rob and I have had some deep conversations, the Cape has afforded me a great deal of success and enjoyment over my 65 years of life. And to the degree that I have any ability in thinking about housing and creating housing and designing, capitalizing, entitling housing, I'm at a point in my life where I can look at it and say, how can I contribute to the creation of housing that is needed, whether it be for sale or for rent, particularly for rent, but also for rent at different income levels to address affordability, not just deep affordability, which has, as Bob has said, it has its own stigma, but at different income, different points on the income ladder, where folks have real jobs, have real careers, are contributing, to the businesses that they are running and or working in, and the society around them, but don't make enough money to buy, the average single family home on Cape Cod, which someone on the call will probably remind me is probably the median price, I think, on the Cape is for a single family residence is north of $700,000. So, we are looking for how do we crack the puzzle, and to create that housing. And I would tell you, and I feel like I'm a broken record. It's a math puzzle. It really is a math puzzle. I mean, we have to figure out how the arithmetic works. How can you overcome, a 18-month to 2.5 year entitlement process where you're carrying land and consultants and expenses from the identification of a piece of land to a permit to break ground. How do you shorten that period and the costs associated with that entitlement period? How do you think about innovatively reducing the vertical and or horizontal cost of producing housing, whether it be, prefab, whether it be smaller? The building codes are great. The climate codes are great. I would tell you that they add significant expenses, and I'm not sure they add, that the expense that they add is appreciated completely by the consumer, or is 100% necessary. We build really tight houses these days. It's a math game. How do we connect a sewer? How do we create income, AMI income pricing levels at 120, 130, 140 that speak to the professionals that are working in our school systems, our police departments, our restaurants, our service providers, our boat yards, the DPW departments, the hospital. In our own little ecosystem down here, we have 2 professional organizations, HUI and MBL, to name 2. Not all of those folks they're staffing those facilities are making the kind of money necessary to do it. So I think it's innovation. I think it's cooperation. I think it's sitting around the table like we are doing right now. I'll look at Thomas here. I'm looking to find Mr. Moakley here. There's a petition. There's a ballot initiative on the fall warrant, statewide warrant for rent control, statewide rent control, the greater of CPI or 5%. That has already frozen investment capital, both on the debt and equity side, on rental projects. Pencils down. I'm not saying that rent control isn't appropriate, but a statewide mandate like that is a really blunt instrument for the purpose. And I think I think if something like that got passed, the availability to produce housing for me and the capital returns necessary to attract capital to take the risk to do these projects by me and others will be impacted, and will be impacted seriously. So I'm ranting a little bit. I guess I will tell you that as a someone that is in charge of a conservation trust. Well, I guess let me sort of say, how did I get into this business? I grew up over in East Dennis. I went off to a prep school in New Hampshire called Holderness, and I completely bought into the environmental education that exposed me to. And I went in and got a geology major. And I love the outdoors. I've hiked the White Mountains from elbow to elbow. I've hiked, walked most of the beaches and open spaces in and around the Cape. I love the outdoors. I believe in preserving appropriate pieces of land. as a conservation leader in my small town on the Cape, we recently went through a process to acquire and preserve a piece of land. And I had a resident say, "Why are we preserving this piece of land? We should be building houses on this piece of land." And my response to that as the leader was, not this piece of land. This is where we would be cutting down trees, as Bob spoke about earlier, impacting wildlife habitat, water quality habitat, and on a piece of land that is surrounded by preserved land on three sides. It is the appropriate piece of land to sort of fill in the missing tooth in the mouth and the smile, where there are others that have already been cleared, that are already an old building that ought to be refurbished or torn down and converted into a more productive use. So I think each piece of land is case by case, whether it is best suited for, preserve, an island of 7 acres in the middle of a development zone could be a perfect park. It could also be a perfect place to develop. So, my thought here is working with smart people like you around the table, Tom, Rob, Mr. Leary, to creatively and collaboratively have real conversations around, what is best for our community, what's best for our economy, what's best for our residents, what's best for our climate. And I think if we can be forthright with each other, that, that's a good point, but it doesn't work. And it doesn't work for the following reason. That's a really good point. I think I will take that into consideration in what I'm doing here. I mean, that's the kind of dialogue that I hope that rational and reasoned folks around the table, around our communities, can have to try to do exactly both of these things: preserve Cape Cod as we know and love it, and also create housing affordability. So that's my babble, Lou. It's probably incoherent to most, but it's. I'll summarize it by saying you got to have willing participants around the table, and it really does come down to making sure 1 + 1 = 4 and 4 + 1 = 6, and the math works for both sides. It's not about lining my pocket or some other developer's pocket. It's about trying to figure out, how do you create housing that can be accessible, economically accessible, to the populations that support, all of the businesses in the community in which we, live, not just the nice homes along the water.
Thank you so much, Jack. One of the things that was brought up in one of our meetings was, what do we really mean by affordability? So if someone wants an average house to own, they need to make approximately household income of $200,000 a year. And if someone wants to rent an apartment that's $3,000 a month, then they need to make $120,000 a year household income. So are we going to be able to get that for waitresses and waiters? Are we going to be able to get that for all of our teachers, a single head of the household? What are we going to do? So as Jack and Bob has said, we need to think out of the box, and we need to come together and listen and come up with new solutions. So that's where we're headed. So next is going to be Rob, and Rob will have another very different perspective, but one that overlaps. So thank you, Rob. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Lou. And again, thank you for all that you do for the Housing and Climate Innovation Center. You truly are the innovation driver for the work that Mass HCIC does, and the young people who come here to the Cape every summer. And I can't express how much I love participating in discussions like this. And I always want to be and typically am the least smart person in the room. And on this panel, hearing Bob, hearing from Jack, and having worked alongside Jack for a little while now, and I know all the work that Representative Moakley does. I know that I'm in that comfortable position of being the least smart person, but I love these conversations because I think, as Jack described, this is at the heart of how we are going to move the needle, here on Cape Cod. It is, bringing the folks around the table, all with their sleeves rolled up and willing to do the hard work of, the ampersand, right? Of being able to talk about housing and, climate, preservation and, development. To do one or to, talk about doing both, or really paying lip service to one and saying we're all about building and we'll pay lip service to conservation, or we're all about preservation and we'll pay lip service to housing, is common, and that's easy. The hard work is really, as Jack does, being a leader in both housing development and in conservation, as Representative Moakley does, in his work on behalf of the constituents of his district and behalf of the entire Cape and the State House, as Bob does in the town of Falmouth. That is the tough work. And I do, my experience, my perspective on this, I came out of law school as an environmental lawyer. I taught environmental law at Boston College to undergrads. I taught it at the law school as part of spring clinicals. And I, came in as an environmental attorney. And, for me, the social justice rooting of environmental law introduced me to the social justice rooting of housing and housing affordability. And that is that's been my passion. I've been fortunate over the course of 30 years of my career to work for developers, to work for a lot of smart people. Most recently, for 2 years, as Lou mentioned, I was the chief legal officer for housing assistance. Now back in private practice, which affords me the opportunity, to work with a number of clients at this space, both here on Cape Cod and off, who are trying to crack that tough nut, that Jack described. And it is, very much a numbers game, right? Projects have to be able to hit affordability if they're going to be able to be rented. They need to hit affordability if they're going to be sold at prices that that hit that target. And development on Cape Cod, like many places, it's kind of like a barbell, right? And you have the market end that takes care of itself, because certainly we have folks buying their, whether it's first home, second home, or third home, who make over $200,000 and can afford to go into a market and have their choice and want to be in the prime locations and the largest homes. That market end takes care of itself. At the low end of affordability, at the 30%, of AMI, that kind of traditional capital A affordable, for folks that are much closer to those minimum wage jobs. We have federally programs and statewide as well, like the low income housing tax credits, right? Which kind of start at 30% of AMI and move up from there. So we've done a great job, supporting at the low end. At the top end, the market takes care of itself. And it's everything in the middle. You hear the term missing middle, and it's missing for a reason, because that's the hard work. That's the hard work of how do we design, how do we comply with energy codes, how do we meet building codes that continue to ratchet up and still make that affordable, where programs and supports are not as available. And I think that does come down, the driver there is innovation, right? That's what we're left with. How do we do this where there's not a support structure, where there's not a roadmap? Because if there was, then that middle wouldn't be missing. But that is where the challenge lies, and that is on the Cape. What is the pervasive housing challenge? Again, we are building at the low end, just because programs that we do, we have inclusionary zoning, we have tools like 40B that are all premised on building for for moderate to low income, and then we have the market in the middle. But innovation, means doing something that hasn't been done before. It means doing something new, and whether that is leveraging means of production that Jack referenced, like modular, or panelized, which come with their own, restraints. So you're talking about dimensional limits, right? Modular is not a magic wand for affordability. They say the most affordable place to build a modular home is right next door to a modular factory. As soon as it comes out of that factory and you have to transport it, suddenly you're adding costs. And the further away you are from the factory, the more additional costs. But you are, left with limits as well. Modular homes, if they're going to be one box on top of another box, maximum of 15 feet, 6 inches. And it means, bringing products to the market that maybe haven't been brought before, that 11, 12, 1,400 square foot home, doing it in a way that's innovative, but with that, it carries risk because it's not been done before. So innovation carries with it risk, and, risk, if you are a builder, you're a developer, you're doing something new, you're doing something risky, you have to price in, and you have to build in, protections and hedging against that risk. So I think part of the innovation is also, how do we mitigate risk? How do we share risk? And whether that is, public-private partnerships, where municipalities are putting up land and making that, what their contribution is, with then, developers being willing, to design and build and create communities that are in a new way, and are done in a way that enhances or better positions their affordability. That, I think, is something as well. And minimizing, risk also, should come with it, sharing the upside, as well. So, what excites me the most is, again, getting in the room as we're doing today, and talking about all of the aspects, of the housing challenge. And, as Jack said, listening to all the ideas, expressing, the concerns, and finding ways that this can work, for not just the ultimate tenants or the homeowners, but all the people that play the link, in how this comes to be. And that does start, locally. It starts in our planning boards, and it's in town meetings, and it's tools that the state is putting on the table, like Chapter 40Y. Talked about that in the last session. A zoning overlay construct that allows, for development of starter home communities. It's tools like unwinding merged lots that had been legal when they were made. Zoning increases render the lots, and if they're held in common ownership, they get merged together. So where you could have had 2 buildable lots, now you only have 1, because the minimum lot sizes have gone up. So it's at every step of the way. It involves, at the granular level, the members of the public and neighborhoods and planning boards and planners, and going to town meeting, and then, engaging and attracting, those developers who have the will, that have the passion for solving, for giving back to the community, and for filling in, those points of the Capes. And this applies, even beyond Cape Cod, but, where the market is not solving for itself easily. Again, that's the tough work, But I think in a lot of ways for me, and I know for others, it's the work that's most rewarding. So, thank you again, Lou, for putting this together, for inviting, to this table, a lot of very, accomplished and thoughtful and talented individuals, and for everyone who's participating, as part of this conversation, whether it's watching this live or later on YouTube. These are the folks, these are the conversations that we need to turn into, sleeves rolled up and getting into the ground and trying new things and finding the models that we're going to be able to build on and take forward.
That's super, Rob. I'm going to ask you one last question, and that is because you have a national perspective when it comes to innovation for best practices to solve these kind of problems in similar places. So there have been many different ways for development that aren't from take a piece of land and develop it, or take a piece of old land and tear it down and develop it, or take a piece of business and turn it into housing. But could you just talk a little bit about the 2 or 3 best practices that we can learn from?
Yeah, no, thank you. And Lou, I think what you're referencing, for 3 years I served on, at a national level, with the National Association of Home Builders, both as a member of their board of directors. I was on their government affairs committee, and have been involved in their, political action committee as well. So it gave me a really interesting perspective of seeing what was happening, in various states. And I think, I think the truth is that, a common denominator among or across, things that you might flag as best practices or most promising, practices have a couple things in common. I think one is that they streamline the process of going from, concept to construction. And, in Massachusetts, even with tools like Chapter 40B intended to facilitate the construction of affordable homes, the process is, at least 6 months long. And, during that 6 months, you've got, costs of attorneys, who have to, take you through projects, through those hearings, engineers, constant, feedback and responding to public comments, all of which is important. But if you had a streamlined process, designs and forms that were approved ahead of time, so that Jack knows if he is looking to do buildings with 8 units, that here's a standard 8-unit building that has already been approved, that there are density numbers and kind of design elements that are identified by towns and saying, bring us a project that has these elements to it, and we will approve that in 1 month. That makes a huge amount of difference, because also during that 6 months you have costs that are just continuing to to escalate. So I think one is streamlining the process. Number 2 is maximizing the yield, and I think that's especially important for a place like Cape Cod, where our land availability is one of our most precious assets. So being able to do the most with land that is available and identified and prioritized for development, and again, to the extent that that's where the infrastructure is for wastewater, where the traffic infrastructure is, where folks can live, work, and play without being dependent on a car, yielding higher unit counts, and the notion that density is a 4-letter word, that we need to get away from that. You literally cannot have it all. You can't say want it to be in a downtown area. We want it to be only of a height that is looks like the single and 2-family homes that are around it. We want it to be available or affordable, And we don't want the unit counts to be so high, because not that we see them, but just hearing that there's going to be 20 units, at a parcel just sounds like too much to us. So I think, again, going in those directions of, if we can streamline the process and, embrace maximizing yields, from land as the Cape's, most precious asset.
Super. That's real helpful. Thank you, Rob. Well, Thomas, I think you have a challenge here. So
All right.
what is the state doing? What are you doing? What do you think the opportunities are here? And how do you think the towns can work with the state and the Cape in general?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Lou, and everybody participating in these calls. Happy to be invited and to participate. And all of you who have participated and are on the call tonight, thank you for caring about this issue. So I am born and raised in Falmouth. My mom was too. But this conversation is a lot more complicated than just going to that aerial map of 1950s Woods Hole that's in the back of Coffee O down there and saying, "Oh, can you believe all this development? How much things have changed?" It's change and development, and more people living in our town is not necessarily a bad thing, right? But the whole point of this conversation is, how do we do it sustainably, and how can we do it in a way that where we are also being responsible stewards of Cape Cod, the landmass itself. So my district includes 3 precincts of Falmouth, but most of my district is the islands, all of the Elizabeth Islands, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket. And I know this is a call of Cape Codders, but I want to spend a few minutes talking about the islands, because they offer Cape Codders and those of you who are having discussions like this a glimpse into the future, and hopefully an instructive glimpse into the future. Because the specific timeline, who knows exactly, but Nantucket's affordability crisis represents the future of Nantucket. The vineyard, and the vineyard's affordability crisis represents the future of Cape Cod. We talked about the median. Somebody mentioned the median home price on Cape Cod being something like 700,000. It's over $1 million on Martha's Vineyard. It's over $2 million on Nantucket. So the conversation on Nantucket is not about how do we make homes affordable for, the missing middle. That's like out of the question at this point. No person who's like working for the town, teacher, firefighter, or like trying to run a small business in the town is going to be able to afford a market rate home on Nantucket. The Vineyard's heading in that direction too. It's largely already there. And the Cape is heading in that direction as well. The thing that the Cape has, at least for now, to its benefit that the islands do not, are bridges. There's police officers, well, there's a police officer I know for sure in Truro who lives in Carver. The reason that you look around and maybe you don't recognize as many officers or as many people working around town as you used to is because they don't live on the Cape. They commute. For Nantucket, that's not really an option as much. Maybe if they're getting paid a lot and their employer is covering everything, they're the fast boat, the High Line that goes from Hyannis every morning and comes back in the afternoon is packed. There are a lot of commuters, but for the most part, that's not an option. So businesses have to offer employee housing, which comes at its own sort of social cost, because it means now your housing stability is tied to your job, and you have 1 bedroom, so you can't really start a family unless you start a whole new life. So that has its own problems as well, although it's all with the best of intentions, and it's all just to make sure that businesses continue to run. Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket were facing, similar to the Cape, but at a much more rapid rate, a huge development, overdevelopment, and the rate of development crisis in the mid 20th century. The way that Martha's Vineyard dealt with that, it was close almost. Senator Kennedy wanted to make Martha's Vineyard a national park. in order to slow the rate of development and essentially give the federal government control over what gets built and what doesn't on Martha's Vineyard. As a compromise to that, the state legislature created the Martha's Vineyard Commission. Many, if not all of you, are probably familiar with the Cape Cod Commission. Martha's Vineyard Commission actually has more power than the Cape Cod Commission because, at least, I mean, this is actually currently being challenged in court, but they have a 50-year track record of being able to review 40B proposals. Essentially anything on Martha's Vineyard has to go through them. And they're tasked with a responsibility similar to the title of this conversation, preserving the character of Martha's Vineyard, not only culturally and socially, but also environmentally. So I want to talk a little bit about what tools the state has put into place recently that are already in effect, and then some things that I think will be helpful as we go into the future with, and share a little bit about what I see as a potentially viable path forward for the Cape and Islands. So the first thing that was mentioned, and hopefully most of you have heard about on the local level as well, is the seasonal communities designation, which was passed by the legislature in 2024 and carries with it a pretty wide set of tools, both at the state level and offering locally to municipalities that opt in to becoming a seasonal community. Falmouth at the most recent town meeting opted in, which I was very happy to hear. My island towns are all already seasonal communities.
Thomas, what does that offer you?
Yep, I was just about to go through it.
I figured you would.
So first of all, you talked about teachers, firefighters, police, municipal employees, public employees. Fair housing law prior to the seasonal communities designation prohibited preferential housing treatment or public employee housing for municipalities. This now allows seasonal communities to offer preferential housing for public employees. Again, DPW, teachers, police, whatever. That is now in the toolkit of any seasonal community, and something that towns' capital plans should start to consider moving forward. Towns can now establish a year-round housing trust fund. Many towns probably already have an affordable housing trust fund that can go up to maybe 120 AMI. There's certain home rule petitions going through. Like I just got a home rule petition for Edgartown passed in the House last week that allows their affordable housing trust fund to go up to 180 AMI. Because again, the everything in Dukes County and Nantucket counties are so skewed. Affordability is just out of the question.
Thomas, could you just tell everyone, for anyone who doesn't know, what is AMI?
Area median income.
Thank you.
So, you know, the problem that I'll just take Nantucket, for example. Last summer, the chief of police of Nantucket was homeless for a period of time. And it's not a question that she doesn't get paid enough. For a town of that size, she's probably the best paid police chief in Massachusetts. It's about the cost there. So since then, she did find housing, luckily. But since then, the town of Nantucket has invested in purchasing a property that was on the market and is now making that available to department heads. And then they're continuing to do so with other public employees as well. So back to the year-round housing trust fund, distinguishing from an affordable housing trust fund, because a year-round housing trust fund is about, obviously, anybody who's living in the town year-round. It's not as much about your income. And to that effect, it would allow you to go up to 240% of AMI. This actually, the reason that a lot of towns haven't instituted this yet is because we need to fix it a little bit. The way it went through in 2024, it didn't allow those trusts to have bonding capacity. So that needs to be fixed in order for financing to ever be able to work. Year-round housing opportunities for artists is in the seasonal communities designation. And some of the things that were already mentioned, like ADUs and single-family zoning districts, year-round attainable residential development on undersized lots. And an interesting piece too, which Falmouth just addressed for the first time in a while this year, I think, increasing the residential property tax exemption. So this essentially shifts the tax burden. It doesn't impact the bottom line of the town. It shifts that cost so I think in Massachusetts currently any town can go up to 35%. Seasonal communities allow a town to go up to 50% residential property tax exemption for year-round residents. And so this would have the practical impact is that it takes the property tax burden off of year-round residents and shifts it onto the second and third home owners. Obviously, I'm just sharing my experience. I've been approached by a lot of people who think that's very unfair, of course, because that means that they're paying more for their second and third homes. But that is also the reality of you don't live here, you don't get to vote at town meeting. In town meeting, the select boards are the ones who decide it. It's just offered by the state as a tool that towns can opt into. As a result of that, it's trying to decrease the associated costs with those who already own homes, but have now, through increased valuations over time, just been getting absolutely strapped by insurance costs and property taxes. I don't know if it's going to have any sort of secondary benefit of trying to entice those secondary homeowners to make their Cape homes their primary homes. I think that I'm not sure. I haven't seen any data to suggest that that's happening or not happening, but it's something I'm curious about. On the wastewater side, some of you may be familiar with the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund that was put into place in 2018. This is specific to the Cape and Islands, although it's part of the state's broader state clean water trust, but it's a separate fund that is only for member towns on the Cape and Islands. Currently, all 15 Cape towns are members. Senator Sierra and I are really trying to talk island towns into joining because, frankly, it's a great deal. The money comes from our temporary visitors, from a 2.75% excise tax on lodgings and short-term rentals. So it's not our residents that are paying for these, but it's our residents that are getting the benefits from it. Because this is, just to give you a sense, I looked up the current numbers. The Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund has delivered $79 million in direct subsidies so far, $216 million in contingent subsidies so far, and $14 million in subsidies for pre-existing debt service so far for all the towns on Cape Cod. So this is a lot of money that is going towards essentially sewering and other wastewater projects at the municipal level to take that burden off of the taxpayers, or at least the residential taxpayers, I should say. Those are two really big tools that are relatively recent that the legislature has enacted in order to benefit specifically Cape Cod and the islands. And it's locally controlled too. It's controlled by a local board with a representative, an equal weighting representative. So it's not weighted by the population of the town. Barnstable gets as much of a vote as Truro or P-Town. And yeah, so that's a huge success story that obviously doesn't cover all the costs of these major projects, but makes a significant dent using other people's money. There was a little bit of, so now I want to shift, and I know I'm going over my 10 minutes now, but I'll shift very briefly to a little bit of looking at the future. So I talked about how on Nantucket, there's no conversation about how do we make homes affordable for people. It's just not going to happen. It's too expensive. So the conversation among government and affordable housing advocates on Nantucket and largely on the Vineyard too is about deed restrictions. Essentially, purchasing open market, free market homes, and then adding deed restrictions on them, or offering incentives for owners to add deed restrictions onto their own homes before they sell them, to make it so that house is now in perpetuity deed restricted to be year-round or attainable or affordable, essentially whoever the administering entity is would be able to set those parameters. The future of housing on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and perhaps Cape Cod too, because we can be a lot more prepared for this than they were, because we see this as a crisis now when we're not at over $2 million per home at median home price, a bifurcated housing market. And where we set the limit, what portion of the housing units in any municipality should be subject to a deed restriction, I don't know. And that's a conversation to be had at the local level on a data-driven basis. But that would essentially make it, again, a bifurcated housing market. So those who are year-round residents have access to essentially an entirely different housing stock than those who are in the open market. I don't think that we have a housing supply problem on the Cape and Islands. I think we have an affordability or attainability problem. To underscore that, you just think about going anywhere in Falmouth. There's more traffic than ever before. There's more lines than ever before, at least, in the on season. But at the same time, businesses cannot hire staff. Enrollment is going down drastically. I think about 8% a year in the Falmouth Public Schools. So recapturing some of that existing housing stock from the open market, second and third home buyers, and whether it's through just directly adding deed restrictions and then reselling them so they're deed restricted, year-round, attainable in perpetuity, or redeveloping them into some other type of entity. I don't think it's one size fits all. This is going to be a combination of building something new with restrictions on it to begin with. Not exactly in a 40B way, because again, the 40B doesn't really work for our area based on the home prices, because those open market homes are just going to exacerbate the problem more than the small percentage of affordable units in that same project are ever going to help. But maybe there's a solution there where in seasonal communities, the open market homes may be open market, but they have to be year round, something like that. So yeah, combination of new builds that are sensible and environmentally wise, recapturing existing housing stock and maybe repurposing it. And I think most predominantly recapturing existing housing stock and just transferring it from being seasonal to year round. And I think, this may seem a little bit anti-capitalist. I understand why it feels that way, but at this point, I think money is the only thing that is speaking right now. The towns are acting almost like Supreme Court judges, where they'll say, well, if we had somebody come to us about these things, then we'll review it. They're waiting for projects to come to them, because that's kind of how things work right now. They have to wait for the developer with the money, with the attorneys and the capability to go through all that crazy expensive entitlement process that the other speakers were discussing in order for the town to even really consider something. This will allow the town to have a real direct role in saying, what do we want in the future? So
this has been really helpful, Thomas. I want to make sure we have at least 20 minutes to go on to our discussion. Any last minute things you want to make sure you do say, though?
Yes. Part of that, where does the revenue come from for deed restrictions? Residential, luxury real estate transfer fees. This is not something that's coming from me. It's something that the island towns have asked for time and time again for decades now. So I do have their home rule petitions in the House. I also have Falmouth's home rule petition for a residential tax, a luxury real estate transfer fee. So again, this would make it so it's not on the backs of year-round taxpayers. It's done on an excise fee, with the first $1 million or $2 million exempt. So if you have built up capital in your home, it would be exempt. And then whether it's 2%, 0.5%, whatever the individual town has decided, over $1 million, over $2 million, that is what creates the fund that then you can turn around, build or purchase properties with deed restrictions for the future.
Thank you so much. So the question we're going to is, first of all, where are we headed? So what's our goal here? You know, we've heard very different and some similar overlapping goals when it comes to making sure that we preserve land, but making sure that we have affordable housing, making sure that we take care of our people who work here. On the other hand, is that really a realistic thing? We've heard that it's an economic issue, a social issue, a justice issue, an issue of development, an issue of environmental sustainability, an issue of climate change and climate resilience, political issues, psychological issues, social issues, NIMBYism, moral issues, issues of legal issues, the law and how we're changing it, social issues, not in my backyard, same thing. I'm not going to let anyone live here who isn't my mindset of who should live here near me. And then we also have risk management, reality, what's realistic, what can we do? So what we're going to do now is open it up for discussion, and ask Thomas and Jack and Bob and Rob to turn off your mute and have you open the discussion. The first question is 10 years from now, where should we be? What's going to be different? Who'd like to start? One at a time now. Go ahead.
Lou,
Bob.
I'll say 10 years from now, we must be digging ourselves out of this hole. Right? 10 years from now, we need to be embracing responsible year-round housing development. As Thomas made so many great points, but one that I think particularly resonated with me is the talk about these year-round deed restrictions, and that I think is both incentivizing development and incentivizing density, but in return, for that, having the housing that we are creating, being that year-round housing, and on the local level, the work that Falmouth is doing, tools like Chapter 40Y, increasing starter home yields on smaller lots. But when that law was first passed, and it was passed, God, I think it was in 22. So that's been on the books for 4 years. It did not allow municipalities that were adopting these overlay districts for zoning to impose a restriction on those homes that they were going to be for year-round housing. That changed. The entire delegation, I think, supported it when the regulations were being finalized, and now we have regulations both in the Seasonal Communities Act and incorporating language for bringing into creating starter homes. So I think we need to be creating the homes and the housing options that target where the need is, and not just creating more second and third homes. Again, the market takes care of itself. Second home market is never going to go away. Values are not going to drop. They're only going to increase. But I think we don't need to be adding more to that. What we need to be focusing the efforts is on the creation of year-round housing. So hopefully that's where I'd like to see us be 10 years from now, making significant progress on year-round housing.
Bob, Jack, Thomas?
Yeah,
Bob,
I'd like to jump in there.
Yeah.
I would like to see sewering becoming common throughout the entire Cape. I think our wastewater and water is a critical issue, and something you can't escape. And you see towns that are working towards sewering. Falmouth is working on its second phase. Mashpee is working on its sewer system. But what's always made me wonder is why hasn't the Cape been considered a regional area to be sewered with help from the state. I mean, we're getting killed with septic regulations and everything else. Title Fives are going out the windows. People are going to have to upgrade to IA systems. And I just don't see why the Cape hasn't been designated as an area of critical concern for sewering.
Okay. Jack, do you have a comment?
Yes, Bob took one of my comments, dealing with sewering. I think that goes to, it goes to preserving open space. It goes to the climate side of things, water quality. I think it is a critical piece that, the thing. I think where are we in 10 years from now? I think that hopefully, the tension of the conversation has been reduced into a point where constructive conversation, whether it be sewering, whether it be I listened to Christy Sanatori give a presentation once, or was this Ted Nizeki? There are many single family, one, two, three bedroom ranch homes that aren't on the water, that sit empty, for night after night, for month after month. As Tom said, how do we open up some of that housing, in an effective, economically accessible way? They're in neighborhoods where, kids can play in the street like I did, where Tom did when we were a kid. Where we aspired to be, Bobby Orr, where we could ride our bikes, where balls were thrown. I think, not only, new ground up work and appropriately situated, but also looking at existing housing stock and thinking about a way to repurpose some of that housing stock to meet some of those needs, whether it's a deed restriction, which I don't know a lot about, or some other way. But, you can drive through, neighborhoods that my family was involved in Dennis. And these are perfect, for perfect homes, for young families, for neighbors, not just vacationers, not just retirees. We need, we want the Cape to be, a place that is welcoming to, folks up and down the socioeconomic, ladder, but also up and down the age ladder. We need us who are retired and devoting our time to talking about these like you all are, but we need hardworking men and women in our communities, educating the kids, coaching basketball and baseball and hockey and all those, and kids that are, lifeguards and the like. And housing is a denominator that allows a lot of that to happen. And there's existing housing stock, and there's housing stock to be built. So I hope that the tenor and the tension around this conversation, which I sense is already moving in the right direction, continues, and it's a more rational conversation as opposed to the heated one.
Thomas, I'm going to let you address not only where we are, but what are the biggest barriers, and what do you think we in our towns and the state could do to remove those barriers to let things move forward?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with everything that Bob and Jack and Rob just said. I would also like to see every town that hasn't already to have a comprehensive housing needs assessment and a housing production plan, but one that isn't just to satisfy a requirement, one that is actually like kind of rooted in fact and possibility. Roadblocks, definitely. NIMBYism, definitely. Zoning. Do we switch? We don't take away the authority of town meeting, but do we say zoning changes are a simple majority instead of 2/3? Is that going to make a difference? Is that even a possibility? I'm not really sure. So yeah, and then I would say leadership, on the both the local level, the state level. I mean, the governor's identified it as her number one priority, and as there's been many examples, the legislature has tried to deliver a lot of tools in the past few sessions related to housing, but particularly on the Cape and Islands where money is driving the conversation, it's hard for municipal governments to say we want to do this, because they're kind of instead pushed into a position to say we just don't want to do that. It's like when you're deciding with your friends or family where to go to dinner and someone just says like, well, I don't want to do that, and I don't want to do Italian, I don't want to do Mexican, and it's like, okay, well, what do you want? So yeah, NIMBYism, local leadership.
Thank you. Jenny, I'm just going to check with you because a couple minutes ago there weren't, I think there were only a couple of questions, and I think they've been addressed so far. But are there any other questions that we should be asking at this point that the people here have asked?
Thanks. There was one suggestion about the Joint Base Cape Cod was once part of Bourne, lots of open space for affordable housing and nature. So I didn't know if any of you wanted to comment on that possibility. And the other piece is a question about whether there are, that you guys know of, are there any town or Cape and Island specific or statewide grants that are offered to residents to help them build sustainable and affordable year-round ADU rentals?
Okay. Do we know of any? Thomas, you familiar with any?
On a residential basis, there's like there may be certain tax incentives. I can't really speak intelligently about anything on the specific residential level. There's a lot of grants and subsidies for more on the developer side, through mass housing and Commonwealth Builder if it's an eligible community. But no, Rob may be able to speak.
Yeah. No, thanks. No, Thomas is right. I mean, the focus of the state really has been on production at scale. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that you do have will, that exists, and you have tools now, that exists with the buy right, ADUs. And, the state just went through kind of a design competition, to identify and recognize ADU designs, that were ready to go. And I think that was a very helpful exercise because number one, you're largely eliminating costs of going to an architect and designing. So I think that was an important step forward. But challenges do exist when you are, when you're building smaller. That doesn't mean building less expensively. And when you talk about building for higher energy efficiency, and Jack and I have had many conversations around that. With the codes, the energy codes, continuing to increase, and taking it from a starting point of today and even 2 years ago and 5 years ago, we were building the most energy efficient homes in the history of home building, right? And now, in the interest of continuing to push to higher standards and getting incremental gains, you're adding significant costs to that. And one concept that has been been kind of floated is allowing or requiring lenders to give you increased borrowing power, so that expenses related to high energy efficiency options are not having to come out of the pockets of the home builders or the homeowners. So making that part of Fannie and Freddie underwriting, kind of an additional fund that would, in the form of either, again, increased lending or tax credits or a combination of the two, incentivize and facilitate, the extra spending that goes into building for higher energy efficiency, and the same thing around resilience, as well. Massachusetts this year has a proposal to adopt a code plus, right? So kind of building to a higher resilience code, minimizing exposure to storm damage. That adds costs. And the trade-off there would be requiring insurers to provide you with lower rates if you are in fact building to a higher standard. So, there are some tools on the table that need to be expanded, and they need to also be made, more accessible, to individual homeowners.
So what would be a really good set of next steps? Obviously, this is complex. So there's no one solution. This is going to be a big box of solutions that are intersectional. But given the barriers that we faced so far, what are some good next steps in the next year, 2 years, 3 years that are going to allow us to remove some of the barriers and move forward without all the frustration and the sense of I want my way and my way only? Rob, you going to say something? Go
Well,
ahead.
no, I was just going to say along the lines of kind of what I mentioned. There are tools and there are programs out there. I think a lot of the time, the only folks that know about those programs and know about the tools are the ones that are in the know, right? The ones that, the builders and developers who have people on their staff that used to work for the state and now they work, for on the private side, and their only job is to kind of take programs and funding that they know about because they used to administer these programs and bring them into, those developers. So I think, there's a knowledge gap and there's an accessibility gap. If we can, take even the tools that currently exist and make them more accessible, on Main Street and more accessible, to individual homeowners, and, whatever form that takes. And it might be, having kind of regional, ombuds, whose only job, is to take programs that might extend across different departments and a whole umbrella and kind of be that information funnel, to make that more accessible to, to individual homeowners and small builders. I think that would be a meaningful step forward to leverage the tools that are already existing, but aren't known about or aren't accessible.
Thank you, Rob. Bob, did you have something you want to say?
Yeah, I think one of the first steps that every town should start taking is looking at your zoning. Here in Falmouth, we actually have some districts that only allow senior housing, which blows my mind because to me that's discriminatory. I couldn't advertise for a roommate and say I want somebody 65 or over. So why do we have a district that restricts an area of land to senior development? And I also wanted to touch base on something that Jack mentioned about the smaller neighborhoods, the old neighborhoods with the little houses on them. They tend to get mansionized. I can't say that three times fast. So I think through zoning we could prevent some of that, and whether it's increasing the setbacks so that somebody can't go setback to setback. Maybe you do a volumetric formula that limits the size of a house so it's unattractive for somebody to buy a piece of property with a house on it like that and tear it down. So I think we need to look at zoning because we have zoning things coming with the Seasonal Communities Act that we are going to be looking at. That's on our agenda coming up in the next month or so in Falmouth. So we also need to look at the smaller lots, the lots that no longer are considered buildable. We need to look at that zoning for those types of properties. Look at how we reuse existing properties, whether it's a building where formally it says you can't put housing on that property. We need to look at situations like that. So I think in the initial phase, I think zoning is probably the lowest hanging fruit right now.
Thank you. I know we've run out of time. So I just want to mention one thing, and that is a theme along all of our 4 webinars here has been innovation. And innovation, as Rob was saying, is doing something different. Not necessarily something you've never done before, but actually things from before that need to be brought back. So if it comes to innovation, the kind of leadership that it takes for innovation is very different than control. It is getting people to think differently. It is challenging people. It is using brainstorming and keeping an open mind. It is collaborating and facilitating discussion. It is to saying, yes, that's a possibility. Let's talk about how we could do that, as opposed to, no, we've tried that before. So I think one of the things we could do, in addition to sharing more information with the general public and trying new things, is to think differently about how we talk to one another, to respect one another, to think about justice issues and preservation issues as much as we think about economic issues, although they're just as important in today's world. So I want to thank everyone who's participated in this workshop and others. I especially want to thank our 4 speakers. I want to thank Jenny for helping with the technology. Thank you so much. And please, if you know anyone who is interested in this, or you'd like them to take a look, just go to our YouTube station, put in my name, Lew Stern, Lewstern, and you'll see. And this is preserving the land and housing affordability, and you'll see all 4 of our videos. Each one is about an hour and a half long, and they're all easy to get to, and anyone can see them. So thank you all very, very much. Have a good spring, wonderful time. Be well, stay healthy, and let's preserve it all.